what I really want to focus on is the human dimensions of climate change and climate solutions. And I feel so inadequate because I only have one cartoon, and but I'll share this one with you. By the way, this is not among the new practices that we're endorsing at the CMB program. I don't know if you can read the subtitle there. It says, "Sorry, Harold, but I'm reducing our carbon footprint." So as you all know, the Climate Mind and Behavior program is working to create a shift in the social and behavioral determinants of climate change. Ultimately, our goal is really to create practices and decisions that reduce our impact on the environment. So why are we all here? We're here because climate change, as we all know and have heard from Paul and others, is really an enormous problem, and our traditional problem-solving approaches aren't working. We really do need to find a new path forward. So the core question is, how do we do that? I think that a really critical place to start is to thoughtfully acknowledge and examine the conceptual models of social change that we all have, that really guide our thinking and about the best means by which we can actually leverage the kinds of changes that we're after. For example, if we're trying to achieve climate stabilization, should we focus on national policy and take a top-down approach such as cap and trade? Should we provide good economic incentives and let the market work its magic? And if there really isn't enough public support for those kinds of policies, should we launch an information campaign and give people better information? Do we need to explain the problem more clearly so that people can make more informed decisions about both how they live their lives and whether they should support national policy? These are all possible approaches. Or perhaps instead the genesis of social change is located in the grassroots, and therefore we should invest our efforts in encouraging political activism. These are all the various types of questions that I'm sure many of us have pondered. How do we create change, for example, in a capitalist system of production, in a democratic system of government, in a consumer society? So our job over the course of the next 2.5 years is to be thinking about those questions. We need to be listening to the numerous presentations that we're going to be listening to that draw ideas from social science, from experience, that give us insights about what types of approaches are effective and which aren't, in order to really assess those ideas in the context of a common framework. I would like to take this opportunity to provide some conceptual models for thinking about those domains and contexts in which those ideas might be applied. So we're going to be hearing a lot of different ideas, and most research is focused relatively narrowly on particular questions. And what I'm trying to do in this presentation is say, what is the broader framework that we can use to be thinking across the insights that are presented from one presentation to the next and across those presentations, and draw on our vast wealth of experience that we all bring to this room, and to be thinking about, okay, not only what do we learn from each presentation, but what does each presentation tell us about these larger considerations about how to create strategies that in fact are going to be effective. So let's start by taking a very macro perspective. What do we mean when we talk about the human dimensions of climate problems? What I tried to capture in this model is the recognition that there are a variety of human systems that are embedded in the larger ecological system. Human systems include technological systems. They include economic systems, social and cultural systems, and political systems. As shown here, individuals then find themselves at the center of such systems. Being at the center means that the actions of individuals are both shaped and constrained by the systems in which they find themselves, but at the same time, individual choice and actions can create change, or they can serve to maintain that system. So there's that interaction there. So take a minute to look at this model and consider where most of our efforts at creating change have focused so far. I think it should become pretty apparent that when most people think about ways of reshaping the human impact on the environment, we tend to focus on changing the politics, on changing the technology and/or the economic incentives, while largely ignoring the social and cultural systems and assuming that changes in government, economic policy, and technology are really sufficient mechanisms or levers for changing individual behaviors or the practices of individuals. In fact, most traditional approaches to solutions have focused on really a very narrow range of top-down strategies that have largely focused on reshaping what I'll call the techno-economic system by making technologies more efficient, creating alternative energy resources, and providing economic incentives that encourage their adoption and use. And while these approaches have achieved some really important changes, I'm not going to argue that point, their success is often limited by the lack of attention to the socio-cultural and psychological dimensions of human systems. Things like social norms, value systems, beliefs, social networks, social status, emotions, myths, etc., etc. So let me give you some examples of the importance of the human dimensions of energy consumption, using some examples from the building sector. From a technological perspective, we like to believe that using more energy-efficient building technologies and building designs will be sufficient for reducing energy use in buildings. And in fact, these technologies are an important element in determining the energy efficiency of a building. But technological approaches often fail to consider occupant behavior, and that's often when they run into problems. For example, many of you are familiar with this research that I have up on the screen that was done on identical residential homes inhabited by demographically very similar families that have shown very dramatic variation in energy use, as much as 200 or 300%. Another interesting example comes from an experiment designed to compare the energy efficiency of new insulation technology in several different military housing units. Several houses were outfitted with a range of new energy efficiency technologies, including insulation and energy-saving appliances and windows. What's interesting is that the house that was designed as the control, or designated as the control, received none of the efficiency technologies, was actually found to use the least amount of energy. The least. The control group. The conclusion? Low levels of energy use in the control building were attributed to, quote, mindful occupant practices, such as turning off appliances and lights when not in use, line drying laundry, using fans instead of air conditioning, and so on. While the experiment was really designed to document the energy-saving benefits of insulation technologies, what it ended up doing was illustrating the importance of occupant behavior. The last study, this last study looks at energy use across 4 different Colorado schools. This is one of my favorites. Among them was a LEED certified school built in 2005. Again, the results are counterintuitive. They found that energy use was the lowest for one of the non-LEED schools that had focused on engaging building owners, operators, administrators, teachers, and students through a people-centered rather than a technology-centered program. So as you can see here, maybe the print is kind of small. This chart compares the annual electricity use of 4 high schools in Fort Collins, Colorado. For now, we'll focus on 2, Rocky Mountain High School on the left and Fossil Ridge High School on the right. As you can see from the chart, by focusing on operator and occupant behavior, Rocky Mountain High School was able to achieve a 50% reduction in energy use between 2000 and 2007. And by 2007, Rocky Mountain was using just 4.8 kilowatt hours of electricity per square foot. How does that compare to the lead school? On the far right, you see that Fossil Ridge High School was using 6.24 kilowatt hours per square foot. But I know what you're thinking. Are these simply anecdotal examples? What are the real possibilities at a national scale? In other words, what are the benefits, really, of understanding and integrating the social and behavioral insights into our work? And what would happen if we really were to apply these insights more broadly? And is such an effort really worthwhile? Several studies have been done in an attempt to document answers to that question, both in terms of potential carbon savings and potential energy savings that could be achieved through people-centered approaches. In a study by NRDC and the Garrison Institute, researchers explored the potential carbon savings of personal actions from 4 categories of behavior: personal transportation, household energy consumption, diet, and waste. What were the findings? They found that if Americans were to carry out some relatively simple and affordable personal actions, we could reduce our nation's greenhouse gas emissions by 1 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalent below business as usual by 2020. That's about 1/7 of the country's 7 billion tons of CO2 equivalent annual emissions at the time of the study. A similar study by Dietz and other researchers in 2009, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, explored a smaller set of 17 potential actions, but also estimated the likelihood that these actions would be actually carried out. So they not only identified 17 actions, but they included a measure in there to determine the likelihood that we could actually get people to take those actions. And this study suggested that a behavioral approach could save 123 million metric tons of carbon per year by year 10, or an estimated 20% of household direct emissions, or 7.4% of U.S. national emissions. Pretty large numbers. In the same year, Skip and I considered the same question. We expanded that list of activities from 17 to nearly 100 different actions in the residential and personal transportation sectors, and considered also, like the Dietz study, the potential energy savings that could be achieved by these by taking into consideration the eligibility of households to actually engage in these behaviors and the likelihood that they actually would. And what did we find? We found that the energy savings in those areas of personal transportation and residential households, the potential savings was on the order of 22%, nearly somewhere between 1/5 and 1/4 of the existing level of energy consumption, or 9% of total U.S. energy consumption. Finally, Gardner and Stern performed a similar study of 27 household actions and concluded that energy savings of nearly 30% are possible. That's a lot of energy and carbon. What do they tell us? They tell us that there actually are very significant amounts of energy and carbon that can be saved by paying attention to the human dimensions of energy and climate change. Moreover, and maybe even, I think, more importantly, these savings can be achieved relatively quickly. They don't require the development of new technologies, and they can be achieved at relatively little cost. Of particular note is that all of these studies are focused on behaviors associated with household-based practices and personal transportation. So as such, none of these is really looking beyond that scope. None of these is looking at the greater savings that could be achieved if we were really interested in looking at wasteful behaviors in the commercial building sector or other areas of transportation. So what we're saying is that, 20 or 30% is a conservative estimate. I also want to note that there are several presentations in the symposium that are going to be talking about that topic. So what are some of the ways in which we can intervene to effectively unlock the potential energy and carbon savings that we've identified? I think this is a really important question, right? We know they're out there. What can we do? How can we actually realize those savings? The field of public health has, done a lot of work, intervention kind of work, and I think that they can provide some real insights based on their own success stories associated with getting people to stop smoking, to use contraceptives, and to engage in less risky health behaviors. In general, interventions can be formulated at 4 distinct levels: policy, the physical environment, media and marketing, and interpersonal interactions. As we know, policy interventions are about changing the rules of the game, redefining how things are done. This level of intervention, typically we think about national policy, but it also includes company policies, utility policies, policies of cities and states. And as stated before, this level of intervention is not new to us. What's different is thinking about both economic and non-economic ways of using these policies that in ways that integrate social and behavioral science insights to make them more effective, to do policy differently. So ideas, for example, from behavioral economics and the use of choice architecture are particularly effective for policy interventions, and I'll talk a little bit more about that if we have time. We also have the ability to shape behaviors through changes in the physical environment, whether through changes in urban infrastructure, such as the addition of bike lanes to support alternatives to driving, or changes in buildings, such as the use of daylighting to avoid the use of electricity. You don't have to be turning on and off the lights if you have that kind of alternative. We can impart or invest in feedback technologies that provide people with more information about their energy consumption practices and make that energy consumption more visible to people so that they actually can make better choices. So all of those technologies can facilitate better behaviors. Again, what's new here is not the idea of using technologies to create change. The new idea is to really reshape the technologies with the goal of achieving particular behavioral outcomes by giving people more rather than less in the way of viable alternatives and in using energy, and more control in the hands of individuals so that they actually can change their behaviors in ways that use less energy. So the example, just to give you a quick example, the thing that I'm thinking about is, the buildings where the windows don't open. So what choice do you really have other than using air conditioning, right? So the same type of comments are largely true for media marketing efforts. While the efforts themselves aren't all that new, what is new is that they move away from mass media and traditional marketing methods toward a wide variety of new approaches and the integration of insights from psychology, neuroscience, and other fields that can really improve their effectiveness. And finally, I want to mention community-based interventions. These kinds of interventions really rely on face-to-face kinds of interactions through work with groups and organizations, and include work such as David Gershon's work with eco-teams, which some of you might be familiar with. He spoke last year at CMB, and the efforts of other groups such as Interfaith Power and Light, and some of the things that we're going to be hearing about in the symposium this week. So what are the behavioral insights that are principles that can really be brought to bear in terms of the interventions? I'm just going to name them here. I was going to talk about, but then I'm going to give you some really quick examples of each one. So I like to think about this as the time model, although people always, and time standing for targeting, informing and communicating, motivating, and empowering or enabling. And every time I call this my time model, inevitably somebody in the audience stands up and says, well, if you spell it backwards, it's emit. So I'm just going to jump to the examples. So when we talk about targeting, social science really has a lot to offer in determining what people, in determining really what is it that people are thinking, why they are thinking what they think, and really revealing the diversity of opinions and perspectives. What we really want to get at here is to create approaches that recognize the diversity in the population, that get past the idea of working with averages, like, the average household uses 10,000 kilowatt hours of electricity a year. Okay, but who's average? Not most people are not average. If you shoot for the average, you miss like 95% of the population. So the idea here is to be very specific, understand the population, be targeted, both in terms of the people and what we're asking people to do. What we have to be targeted about. Is it enough if I come out and say, can you please use less electricity? And the first thing that you're going to ask is, how do I do that? And if I say, well, turn off your air conditioning, you're going to say, but I don't have an air conditioner. Turn down your thermostat. I don't use air conditioning, so it doesn't really work. So we need to be targeted about who we're talking to and what we're asking them to do. So this example, I'm sure most of you are familiar with. It's from the Six Americas study. It shows how answers to different survey questions concerning climate change can be very effective in identifying particularly salient groups within the population, as well as revealing relevant characteristics of group members. This research, I think, has obvious implications for the development of social marketing efforts, but could also be used at other levels of intervention. So one other example in terms of targeting, as I said, involves the types of behaviors. What is it that we want to target? It's not enough to know what people think about climate change. Once we know what they think, we can develop marketing materials to try to convince them to think differently, but ultimately what we're after is getting people to do something differently, not just think differently. And that do something differently can be, it can be an attempt to change voting behavior around policy. It can be to generate support for certain policies, and it can be about energy use practices. It can be about a whole variety of things, but we need to understand what is it that we're really trying to get people to do. In order to target behaviors, we need to understand what it is that people are currently doing, where the opportunities lie in terms of change that we're after, what the barriers are that impede those shifts in behavior, and the degree to which there's variation across the population. So this example is from Gardner and Stern's shortlist publication. They were really among the first researchers to work to identify which behaviors should really be targeted to achieve the greatest level of energy savings. And I'm not really endorsing the study because I have my own issues with it, but it's just one example. Okay, so the second element of the time model is information and communications. We used to think that getting people to change what they did was as simple as providing people with good information, right? I like to talk about this as the if people just knew model, right? If the people just knew model sort of argues that you give people good information, that's going to change their attitudes about climate change. And of course, if people know what we're up against, of course they're going to change their behaviors. But in fact, we now know better than that, right? So this is a model by Al Bandura. It's one example of a social science model that provides a much more complex assessment of what it takes to turn information into action, recognizing all of the potential problems along the way. I'm not going to go into the details here, but it's really just to illustrate that social science really can provide us with some insights about how to move forward and actually achieving that 20, 30, 40% savings that we can just by doing things a bit differently. So one last comment here is to recognize that that sort of attitude-behavior relationship that we all think we understand, in fact, even when it does exist, and it doesn't always exist, this relationship between attitudes and behaviors, sometimes it takes the reverse form. In fact, if you, and this is really at the heart of why, you have the drive or take the bus to work day, or ride your bike to work day, or, because sometimes when you engage people in the behaviors, in fact, that can trigger new attitudes about, what, I actually like biking to work, and maybe I can see myself differently now, and my attitudes around those behaviors can also change. So the second important contribution, I think, of social insights in the realm of climate change information campaigns is that they're increasingly being applied in a whole variety of new types of ways, from community-based social marketing to education entertainment programs to innovative new computer games. And those efforts are increasingly drawing on social science insights to really help people turn that information into action through motivation, which is my next point. So what is motivation? Motivation is really about getting people to take that next step, to really take that information and do something with it. More and more interventions are using social science insights, including norms research about social norms, networking theory, goal setting, modeling, and other related topics to create more effective programs. How many of you have seen this before, some slide like this? How many are familiar with O-Power and the work that O-Power is doing? Quite a few people. I'm not surprised. The word's getting out. And part of the reason the word's getting out is, social norms work. Using this research is effective. So O-Power, as some of you might know, is a private sector company. They create home energy reports. They mail them to households on a monthly basis. They've developed these home energy reports in conjunction by hiring basically a social psychologist, Robert Cialdini, to provide them with guidance in the development of this well-known approach. O-Power uses descriptive norms to show people how their energy consumption compares to other households like theirs, because I'm sure if I asked you even now how many kilowatt hours of electricity you use, let's just ask. How many of you know how many kilowatt hours of electricity you use generally, or last month? Roughly. It doesn't have to be down to the last digit. Okay, how many of you know how that compares to your neighbors? And we're in the game. We're the experts, right? So, if people don't have that kind of information, it's really hard to tell whether, even if you know how much you're using, how do you know if that's good or bad? How can you make that assessment? You can't. And so social norms are really important to doing that. And O-Power has tapped into that. So they use these descriptive norms. They compare people to their neighbors like them. They also use injunctive norms to signal to low-consuming households that they're doing a good job, right? So that they don't sort of regress to the norm, right? They don't actually increase their use, because that actually has been shown to happen. So they put smiley faces on their bill, and guess what? That's enough. Putting a smiley face on your home energy report, if you're doing a good job, that's enough to keep people from regressing to the average. Go figure, right? Who would have guessed? So as a result, people who are getting these home energy reports, once a month, paper reports, low tech, are reducing their energy consumption, and I hate to say this, but on average, 2 to 3%. That's it, a home energy report. I also just want to note that O-Power is also using 2 of the targeting techniques that we mentioned before. First of all, they're collecting a lot of information about their customers, both through private and public sources, and they are able to use that to specify which households are most likely to save energy as a result of this effort. But then OPower is also using this information about households to provide targeted recommendations. You can see at the bottom of this home energy report, they're giving people examples of things that they can do to actually reduce their energy consumption. And these are very targeted. They're not telling people to turn off your pool water heater if you don't have a pool. And they're not telling people to turn off their AC if they don't have an air conditioner. So by applying several behavioral principles, OPower is able to really enhance the effectiveness of their approach. In fact, one important note that you might not know, even if you know OPower, more recently they've been experimenting with the use of goal setting and other approaches and have found that households who set goals were able to achieve average savings more in the line of 8%. So again, it's sort of, bringing these different approaches together in ways that can really get people to change their intentions into actions. So the final element that I want to talk about is empowering or enabling people to take action. It's about creating the right conditions in ways that facilitate the desired actions or behaviors. And this is where the policy and the technology really come into play and play really an important role in facilitating that society-wide transition that we're trying to achieve to really create those new climate-related practices. So social science plays an important role here as well, both in determining what the barriers are, both real and perceived barriers, and in terms of understanding the decision-making processes, and finally, in terms of using social psychological principles to guide behavior toward favorable outcomes. So I'm just going to give you one quick example from my own experience. I was personally interested in knowing how choice architecture, how many of you have heard about the book Nudge? Yeah, lots of people. It's fascinating, isn't it? So I read that book and I was like, wow, this is really interesting. I want to try that. So I did. When, in 2009, I was the chair of the Behavior, Energy, Climate Change Conference, and I decided what a better opportunity to do a little experiment, right? So we all know that meat-based meals have a much larger carbon footprint than non-meat-based meals. And I had learned, like many conference organizers, ACEEE standard conference was giving people meat-based lunches. And I started to wonder whether or not it was really a preference of conference goers to eat meat at every meal, or whether they simply didn't take the time or effort to opt out of the meat-based meal when they registered for the conference. So I decided, well, let's change the status quo. Let's change it from a meat-based meal to a vegetarian lunch option. We'll still give people the option of opting out of a vegetarian meal if they feel strongly they really want to have meat in their lunch. They can choose to have meat in their lunch, and they will be given meat in their lunch. But people who didn't opt out were given a vegetarian meal. I have lots of stories about how that went over with the conference organizing staff that I'd love to share with you later. But the punchline, or the result, was just absolutely dramatic. By making the default meal choice vegetarian, we went from 83% of people in the prior year at the BEC conference, Behavior, Energy, Climate Change, people attending that conference went from 83% of people eating meat to just 20% of people eating meat. A dramatic turnaround. What if all conference organizers made this their policy? We could reduce the number of meat-based meals by 75%, with even more dramatic implications for the climate, given that meat eaters contribute 7 times the greenhouse gas emissions as vegans. Wow. So just to recap, top-down techno-economic approaches, I think, maybe I should modify this statement. They're not ineffective. They're not ineffective. They're not effective enough, I think is the right way to say it. Aspects of the human dimensions that are often ignored are the social, cultural, and psychological approaches to understanding human behavior. The potential scale of these kinds of savings, this kind of change, and the results from them are relatively quick and relatively inexpensive. Interventions should occur at multiple levels of that target that I showed you. And social sciences can really help in our efforts to target, inform, motivate, and enable better practices and decisions. Thank you.